Well, thank you for the nice introduction. I'm supposed to introduce Steve, and this is a difficult task. He has a distribution list for his research, and I'm on his distribution list. It's quite staggering. He produces commentaries and papers on practically everything you can think of. I'm inclined to refer to him as a Renaissance man. My guess is if you were to ask his students, they would probably tell you that he's a one-man university. So instead of trying to cover all of that ground, I prepared 3 slides that I'd like you to read about Steve. The first one, you've probably already seen this one. Also, I'd like to mention he lives on 2 continents. In addition to having a home in Baltimore, where he's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, he also has a home in Paris. And from these locations, he's become famous throughout much of Europe, much of Asia, much of South America, and parts of Africa. So he's known just about everywhere. Let's look at the next slide, please, Kate. These are some of his other positions. As you can see, they're dispersed all over the world and in many different areas of expertise. It's just amazing the breadth and depth of his contributions in so many different areas and fields. It's astounding. Now, this is his honorary degrees. I don't know if any of you have ever even heard of somebody that had this many honorary degrees. And if you look at them, they're from everywhere. He has honorary degrees from everywhere. Doesn't have one from KU yet, maybe pretty soon. There's one more. That's the last one.
That's a good idea, Bill.
I should mention that I prepared questions to ask Steve. A couple of days ago, I offered to send the questions to him. He declined. He wanted this to be extemporaneous. So he doesn't know what I'm going to ask. He didn't want that. But he told me he might want to say something initially. Did you want to say something initially?
That'd be great, yeah. I'm anticipating, knowing Bill as I do, a little mini PhD exam, so I have lots of notes. He said I would be allowed to use notes. So, at any rate, it's great to be with you, and particularly knowing that this is the first, I guess, distinguished John Ice lecture, because I wrote my good friend Vernon Smith, who's obviously the most famous economist ever to put his foot on KU soil, I wrote him yesterday, and he wrote me back immediately. I said Bill had just informed me that this is going to be actually a distinguished lecture series that was starting in the name of John Ice, and Vernon had asked me to write a dust jacket blurb for his 2-volume memoirs and A Life of Experimental Economics is volume 1. So I checked volume 1, and sure enough, I could detect, I remembered this because I'd reviewed and helped Vernon put together his memoirs when he did that, and I remembered Ice was featured in there. So Vernon wrote back, and he said, I'm going to read now what he wrote me yesterday. I wrote him, and he wrote me like 2 hours later. I forwarded this to Bill. I love John Ice. Went out to see him years later on his deathbed. Although Dick Howey, the historian of economic thought who wrote the definitive history of marginal analysis, influenced my career more directly. Have a great visit. I know that you and Barnett will have an engaging interaction. I also had Leland Pritchard for Money and Banking at KU. I learned more about money from him than from 3 years at Harvard. he would have been outraged that the Fed pays interest on excess reserves. Vernon. So I know that Vernon is delighted that this lecture series is underway, which leads me to my second remark, and that's, well, how did I get to meet Bill? And I got to meet Bill in the following way. I tend to read most things that I can get my hands on, even the New York Times. And on October 21st, 2009, William A. Barnett penned a piece called "Who's Looking at the Fed's Books?" And I read it and I thought, God, this guy is on top of things. He really knows what he's doing. The key sentence in here: clearly the money borrowed cannot exceed total reserves, so non-borrowed reserves should not be negative. Well, he pointed out that non-borrowed reserves at the Fed were negative, which is obviously a impossibility unless you're cooking the books, which he pointed out. So I picked up the phone. I didn't know who Barnett was, and he's working in a specialty and so forth. About the only thing with regard to price indices that I knew anything about were the Posh and Lesper's indices, and I didn't know anything about aggregation theory, and I think maybe I'd vaguely heard about divisia, but I really didn't know anything about it. So I called Bill and announced myself, and the first thing he said, "You're famous." And my reaction was, the guy's even smarter than I thought. And we had a great conversation, and he said, look, I've just finished a manuscript. Would you read it? And it was his book manuscript that subsequently was published at MIT, as you know. I worked on it actually more or less for a week, and Bill will indicate that I sent him very extensive notes and comments and so forth, and so that was the start of our professional relationship, and subsequently we communicate regularly and so forth. Now, this is the first time I've had the pleasure of actually meeting Bill in person. But there's another aspect to this. Besides the book, after I reviewed the book and Bill had made arrangements to have it published at MIT, the new chairman and founder of the Center for Financial Stability called me, and he said, look, I'm going to be in Washington. I want to stop on my way back to New York. This is Larry Goodman, and pick your brain. And so he was just starting the center, and he said the key is we've got to get a heavyweight involved in this thing that really makes a contribution. And I said, well, Barnett's the guy. And so he looked into it and he said, Barnett is the guy. Well, now you know that Bill Barnett is the guy at the Center for Financial Stability, and that's where a lot of his research work is disseminated and so forth. So that's the kind of connection we have and how things started. The other Kansas connection I have, which is actually not KU, it's K-State, if I may use that that title. I'm a farm boy from Iowa, right up the road, and another farm boy from Iowa that lived right down the road from us is somebody named Dwayne Acker. Now, Acker is 10 or 11 years older than I am, but he used to deliver every week a freshly dressed chicken to my mother. And I was the kid, this is circa 1953 or 4 or something like that. I was the kid who paid Dwayne for the chicken. And Dwayne reminded me a few weeks ago that that chicken was 60 cents a chicken, fully dressed, fresh. So this has something to do with economics. You see, there's something called inflation. And the quality of the chicken was excellent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he's the president emeritus of K-State, and he was a president from 1975 to 1986. And when he retired, he went back to the home place close to where I grew up, back in Iowa, and is still holding down the fort actively. The last person I would like to just mention that's relevant to what we'll be talking about today, perhaps, is Senator Dole. Senator Dole, of course, is a Kansan, a good friend, and when he was leading the Senate, offered from the floor something that's called the Hanke Amendment. And the Hanke Amendment, so Dole maneuvered this whole thing himself and knew about it, and the whole thing was set up. And if you're putting an amendment into a bill, this was a foreign operations bill in October of 1992, you have to be clever like Dole. And you have to be able at the right time to slip an amendment in when no one else was looking. Now, the amendment, as it turns out, was the following. I was very involved with Russia after the fall of communism and was pushing very aggressively for them to institute a currency board arrangement in which the ruble would become a clone of the US dollar, because under a currency board, of course, you issue a local currency, but it's backed 100% with anchor currency reserves, and it trades at an absolutely fixed exchange rate with whatever the anchor currency is, and it's freely convertible. There are no capital controls, exchange controls. So the local currency becomes a clone. We went through, I wrote a book about this with Kurt Schuler and Lars Jonig, and was very active in the scene. Now, for some reason, the IMF didn't think this was a good idea. And the IMF can be highly political, as it always actually is highly political, and it will remain so, even though the new director is a Bulgarian, but she's not going to be able to change the world over at the IMF. But at any rate, they were opposed, and the idiotic excuse they came up with was the following. They said that the U.S. Congress would not be for a currency board in Bulgaria. Well, number one, the U.S. Congress didn't know anything about a currency board for Bulgaria, for the Soviet Union, Russia, and had nothing to do with it, and never has anything to do with it. So what we decided with Dole, we'll put an amendment in the Foreign Ops Bill that would propose U.S. funding for a currency board to establish the reserves required in Russia at that time if the Russians decided they wanted to have a currency board. So it just made a complete end run around the IMF and made all our objections were irrelevant, because once this bill came in, it literally was law. So at any rate, with that bill, I can see you're looking at your watch. I think I'm taking up too much time. He does have a real mini PhD exam set out for me, and I'll let him proceed with that now, Bill.
Well, he's already covered some of my questions, so this works well. And now you know the source of my connection with the Center for Financial Stability, this guy.
And the book manuscript, you see. I did learn a lot. I don't know too much still about aggregation theory, but I know the basic ideas after working on that manuscript. And I'm a devotee of divisia.
He's too modest, but anyway, continuing with this, he's mentioned currency boards. He has become very famous for currency boards that he's designed for many countries throughout the world that were suffering from hyperinflation. And I'd like to ask him about those countries for which his currency boards have been most successful.
Okay, let me make a couple of remarks about currency boards. First of all, when you look at developing countries, most developing countries should not have central banks. And the reasons they shouldn't have is that the reasons they have, of course, theoretically, from a textbook point of view, is you can fine-tune the usual fine-tuning thing and adjust the economy because you can be counter-cyclical. Well, in fact, most central banks in developing countries are pro-cyclical. So they're destabilizing forces from a cyclical point of view. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they're basically fiscal agents. They extend credit to the fiscal authorities, meaning that they inject a soft budget constraint in the budget of these countries. So the countries tend to be quite irresponsible from a fiscal point of view and run quite large fiscal deficits and accumulate a lot of debt. And the problem with the debt is twofold. Number one, it's just the typical problem with debt. But more importantly, the debt is usually denominated in foreign currency. So they end up with huge amounts of risk associated with the debt that they're actually accumulating. So the key thing that makes this go around is a central bank and printing their own money. A currency board, you have two ways to put a hard budget constraint in the system. One is a currency board, and a currency board obviously can't extend credit to the fiscal authority, so it's a hard budget constraint. The only way that you can get local money from a currency board is to take foreign exchange in and exchange it at the fixed rate and get the local money back. So the currency board can't extend credit to anyone, period. So this is the key thing, Bill, about the currency board. Most monetary economists, if you read articles in the journals, they're all irrelevant rubbish, basically, because they're worried about what's happening to the real exchange rate, this, that, and the other thing. The key is the hard budget constraint. And as a result, there have been over 70 currency boards in history. And I'm getting into now answering Bill's question. There have been over 70. The fiscal deficits are less, the debt to GDP is less, the inflation's less, and the growth rate's greater than the alternative central bank or comparable arrangements. So they're very superior to central banking. That's the first point. By the way, the second point is there's kind of a cousin in this, dollarization. Dollarization is really the equivalent of a currency board. The only difference is you have no local currency, and so you make no seigniorage. With a currency board, you make seigniorage because your liabilities don't pay interest, and the reserves you got backing the local currency, of course, make an interest. So they're always profitable. They're always successful. There hasn't been one currency board that's failed, and that's even including, most people don't know this, this was an accidental kind of discovery. We were in the archives in a library in London, and what did we stumble across, Kurt Schuler and I? John Maynard Keynes designed a currency board that was installed in North Russia during the Civil War. The whites had a currency board. So they had a sterling-backed ruble. Even that currency board did not fail. Everyone who held rubles from that currency board were able to redeem them after the Civil War was decided and the whites lost. They redeemed in London. The reserves were all kept in London anyway, safe and sound. The only exception that people get confused about, and Schuler did a study in Economic Journal Watch. If you go back, you can check this out. Argentina supposedly had a currency board. Well, it didn't have a currency board. It had a convertibility system. It looked a lot like a currency board. I won't go into all the details of the loopholes in the convertibility law. I was involved in that in the sense that Menem asked me in 1989 what was the problem in Argentina. He'd just been elected. He had a very liberal Big Bang kind of policy. He was going to clone and copy what they'd done in Chile to liberalize the economy. Had a minister for privatization, everything. Nothing was happening. He was going no place. I had an opportunity to meet him. He asked what I thought, and I said, as long as you have triple digit inflation at the time, I said, you will have no credibility and you won't be able to implement one reform that you've got on the table. He said, well, how do I stop the inflation? I said, you've got to put a currency board in. He said, what's that? How do you do that? And I explained a little bit. He says, why don't you write a book on that and we'll publish it in Buenos Aires, which Schuler and I turned the thing around very quickly, and it was an orthodox currency board. Then the idea was taken and the convertibility law was written by the then Minister of Economy, Domingo Cavallo, but it had very many loopholes and lots of wiggle room. It was a fixed exchange rate where the peso traded at 1-to-1 with the US dollar, okay? There was free convertibility, and it looked like, at least on the surface, the reserves were set at 100%. But the problem was there was a kind of flexible floor. Under certain conditions, they could go down to actually 66%. So that was one problem. The big problem was there was no ceiling on the thing. So as a result, you could have huge amounts of sterilization going on. With a currency board, the balance sheet's the key thing. You look at the balance sheet of a currency board, and you have no net domestic assets on the balance sheet. You only have foreign reserve. Or if you have net domestic assets, they're frozen. With Argentina, the net domestic assets, due to the fact that they didn't have a ceiling on the reserve level that they had, that you should have 100 to 110%. That's the range. So you have a little, it's not exactly 100 to 110. So you have a huge amount of sterilization. So the net domestic assets were fluctuating all over the place. In Argentina, the net domestic assets were more variable by 6 times relative to Chile at the time from 1995 until the whole thing collapsed in 2001 than Chile, and Chile had a floating exchange rate. So the net domestic asset, they were doing much less sterilization actually in Chile with a floating exchange rate than they were doing in Argentina, where they had this convertibility thing. Ultimately, it collapsed because the convertibility, the foreign exchange started going down, and what did they do? They started buying domestic debt, and the net domestic debt goes up, and so the composition of the monetary base completely gets changed around. Instead of being 100% based on foreign reserves, the foreign reserves went down. I don't know I can't remember the percentage, but they went way down. So it basically was a fixed exchange rate
like a pegged exchange rate, where you ultimately end up with contradictions between the exchange rate policy, which is fixed, and the monetary policy. You see, with the currency board, you only have an exchange rate policy. You have no monetary policy. You only have an exchange rate policy. In Argentina, they had an exchange rate policy and a monetary policy. So this is a little bit of a long answer, but let me make a couple of comments. You're probably saying, if these things are the best thing since sliced bread, there's never been a failure because Argentina wasn't a currency board. The Schuler article in the Journal of Econ Journal Watch, he did a survey of the top 100 economists in the world. 94 of the 100 were referring to Argentina as a currency board. It wasn't. All you had to do is look at anyone looking at the balance sheet would know that the thing wasn't a currency board. Any rate, why were these things abandoned? Because they covered all of Africa, by the way, and huge chunks of Asia. If they work so well, you had something happen. You had the colonies gained independence after the Second World War. Most of these African countries were colonial, and the currency boards were colonial. And the biggest currency board today is where? It's in Hong Kong, which isn't a colony now, but it was installed in 1983 when Hong Kong was a colony. So the colonies became independent, and that meant that any colonial institutions were trashed. So that was one problem. The second problem was Keynes, because Keynesian economics, it wasn't Keynes, it was Keynesian economics. After all, Keynes established a currency board. It was Keynesian economics and the idea you could fine-tune and smooth everything out, and smooth as silk kind of thing. And then the third aspect was the IMF and the World Bank. Those two institutions came in with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, and if you set up a central bank, that's jobs for the boys. You have to have technical assistance. You have to have everyone coming from Washington to show you what to do. So these three things were the big killers for currency boards. It wasn't that they didn't perform well. They performed very well. But it was the configuration of these three. It was kind of a perfect storm, basically. Quickly, I've already gone over Argentina, Bill. Back to, it's been so long since Bill asked me the question, you've probably forgotten what it was. He asked me how have the ones I've been involved with performed. So Argentina wasn't a currency board, so forget that. 1992, Estonia, we decided that there was a great opportunity to put in a currency board there because they were still using the Russian ruble. Estonia was independent, but they were using the ruble. They hated the Russians. Anything to do with the Russians or Soviets, but they were stuck with the ruble. So it was a perfect opportunity. We had good intelligence. You need good intelligence for these things. Lars Jonig was the big professor at the Stockholm School, the #1 monetary guy. He was also Prime Minister Carl Bildt's chief economic advisor and knew what was going on. So Bildt was going to support this. So I got on the phone a little bit like with you, Bill, and I said, let's write a book. So Schuler, Jonig, and me, we not only wrote the Russian currency and finance book, we wrote a book for proposing a currency board for Estonia. It was published in Stockholm in English. It was published in Tartu, Estonia, in Estonian. The thing you have to remember, if you're doing these things, you have to have firepower. You have to have a book. You can't just go in and say, I got a great idea, you know. You got to have the book. And so we had a book in Estonian, and we had this. We also had another key element. I had a very good friend, a very important Estonian expat who was Venezuelan, actually. He went from when the Soviets came into Estonia, he made his way to Venezuela, and made a fortune, was living in Paris, New York, Caracas, et cetera. But he knew the local scene in Estonia, and he said, look, let's go to Tallinn. I'll organize all the meetings. You address, they still called it the Supreme Soviet then. It was independent, but they still called the parliament the Supreme Soviet. So I addressed them. We had the book. We spent a day with my friend, my Estonian friend, Mrs. Hanke. The most memorable part of that, we bought tremendous icons that of course had been stolen in Russia someplace and ended up in Tallinn, but we have many of them at home. As they say, that's just a footnote, Bill, but it was an interesting trip. So we get on the plane with Harry Manil to go back to Paris, and he said, you sold them. He said, they're going to do this. And he said, I think I should go back and give a speech in Estonian and seal the deal. And so on the plane going from Tallinn to Paris, Harry and I wrote his speech. He got on the plane the next day or a couple of days later, went back to Tallinn, gave the speech. This was in May, and this is Estonians. You have to get the culture where you're at. Estonians are very hard-nosed. They make a decision and they charge. And so they made a decision in May when we were there. On June 20th to the 22nd of 1992, May, June, 1 month, they installed a currency board. The ruble was out, the kroon was in, the thing performed beautifully. They ultimately were part of a unified currency area with the Eurozone because the euro was became first the Deutschmark was the reserve, then it became the euro. They were already part of a unified currency area with the Eurozone, so they entered the Eurozone, and now they have the euro. 1994 was the next stop, and that Mrs. Hanke and I were in Paris, and I get a call from the Prime Minister's office in Vilnius, and he said, the chief of staff said, could you come and have lunch with the Prime Minister, Saslavicius? And I said, yes, but what's on the agenda? And he said, well, he wants to put in a currency board. This was in 1994, so of course, Ms. Hanke and I got on the plane, and as soon as we could, we went to Vilnius. He'd been to Estonia. He'd seen what was going on. And he PhD from Moscow State, agricultural economics. The guy knows what he's doing. He's smart. And he saw that the thing worked. And he knew exactly why it worked. He knew it was a hard budget constraint. He was having he controlled, he was in the Socialist Party, meaning the ex-Communist Party. So he had control of the parliament, but he couldn't control their budget activities. And that's why he wanted the currency board. So we had lunch. About halfway through lunch, he said to the chief of staff, get the papers ready for Hanke. He's going to be a cabinet minister. And the chief of staff jerked back. He's not Lithuanian. So, and I'm telling these to give you a little color of how things actually work in the real world. So he said, we'll make him a state councilor then, because that has cabinet rank. So I became a state councilor. I had all my papers and everything before we left our lunch. I had published, by the way, there was a little preamble to this. I had published in Lithuanian a proposal for a currency board. This is before I had met him. So it was in the wind. He didn't just dream it up after a visit to Tallinn. That one went very well. Then they joined the euro. That's fine. The next one was in Bulgaria. It's a little bit of a long story. The chairwoman will probably know some of this. It started actually in 1990. I was a chief economic advisor for the Markovic government in Yugoslavia, which was reform government. And the average inflation rate in Yugoslavia, the 10 years prior to me joining in 1990, had been 76%. It was the second highest average inflation rate in the world. Zaire had the highest from 1980 to 1990. So they were interested in having me for privatization and other things, but also the currency board kind of idea. So I published a book, the first book actually that was published on currency board. Schuler and I wrote it, and it was published in London in English, but it was published in Serbo-Croatian in Belgrade. Yugoslavia is right next door to Bulgaria, and for some reason I really wanted to go to Bulgaria. So did Mrs. Hanke. So we, the minute we could, we went to Bulgaria, and I wrote a book about Bulgaria, proposing again a currency board. This was published in 1991, and kept going to Bulgaria for years, and finally I just gave up. I loved Bulgaria, but it was going no place. They were just stonewalling. I met the prime ministers, the head of the central bank. Valchev was the head of the central bank then, Professor Valchev, and the Bulgarian opinion was, Professor, you have a great idea, you're very respected and everything, but we have everything under control. Well, all hell broke out in 1996, and the monthly inflation rate reached 242% in February of 1997. Well, at that point, the president was Petr Stoyanov, and he brought me in as his chief advisor. A book that Schuler and I had written, by the way, it got knocked off and translated into Bulgarian. It was actually, I've been on the top 10 bestseller list for one book in economics, and it was that Bulgarian book in Bulgarian. And so we'd always stay at the Balkan Hotel, and the first thing I'd do in the morning, I wanted a copy of the knocked off book. So I'd run to the kiosk as fast as I could, and the guy would never have any. He says, "Oh, we sold them all out." So finally, he spoke enough English, and I could communicate with him. I said, "Look, save me 5 of those things for tomorrow." And so I got my 5 copies of the knocked off book. To make a long story short, with Stoyanov, he bit the bullet. We put the currency board in July of 1997. It was a fantastic success. The annual inflation rate went down within 1 month. It went down into high single digits. So, and they still have the currency board in Bulgaria. I'm advocating they keep it and don't join the euro. Now, why would that be? The lev is a clone of the euro. They have the same monetary policy as the eurozone. It's the hard budget constraint. There's no moral hazard with a currency board, because if they join the euro, they can be like Greece. And knowing the Bulgarian culture like I do, I know exactly how they think. We'll spend as much as we want, we won't balance the budget, and Brussels will bail us out. And that's why I don't want the currency board to go, and I don't want them to join the euro, because they lose the hard budget constraint. They enter a huge moral hazard kind of problem. The last one was Bosnia. Bosnia was very interesting. It was also in 1997. Bosnia has a currency board. They still have a currency board. And the currency board was basically designed out of that first 1990 book that Schuler and I published in Serbo-Croatian. We didn't have a currency board in Yugoslavia. They decided they'd have a civil war instead of having a currency board. In May of 1991, the Civil War started, and that was the end of that. But Milosevic was still in power. And they had gone through, by the way, we might talk about hyperinflation but my first dose of hyperinflation, measuring it and so forth, was actually in Yugoslavia, not Bulgaria. January 1994, the annual inflation rate, which I measured, and I was the first one to do it, 313 million% per year. Very big hyperinflation. Milosevic was in power. So they have their civil war, they had the Balkan Wars, the Balkan War against NATO, the Dayton Accords come up, and part of the Dayton Agreement, Article 6, mandates that Bosnia-Herzegovina must have a currency board for the first 6 years of its existence. So the State Department called me and they said, look, we really want to make certain that this Dayton Accord is lived up to and that they don't screw it up. So we want you as the advising, the writing the law, basically, and installing the thing. So we went to Sarajevo, and it was literally the shooting hadn't really stopped yet. We flew in a Dutch, Mrs. Hanke and I, in a Dutch aircraft carrier, because all the bridges had been wiped out. You could not go into Bosnia. You couldn't get to Sarajevo by road. You had to fly in. So we flew in, stayed there, negotiated, wrote the law and so forth. That thing has been terrific. Then, as a footnote to this, I never exactly figured out what happened and how it got in the Dayton Agreement, this mandate. So Richard Holbrooke, as you know, was the big negotiator in the Dayton Agreement and the big ambassador during the Balkan Wars. I happened to have lunch with Holbrooke in Hong Kong, of all places. Mrs. Hanke and I had lunch with him in May of 1998, and so. Remember, this was about a year after we put the currency board in, and I said, how in the world did that thing get in the Dayton Agreement? And he says, he said, Milosevic had no problem with this. He said, we proposed a currency board, and Milosevic said, he said, whether this is true or not, I don't know. I mean, I know what he said to Holbrooke. He said, I'm familiar with Professor Hanke's book. It's in Serbo-Croatian. He says, and I'm a banker. Milosevic was a banker before he was in politics. And he says, fine. Article 6, he just signed it. And they had no debate or anything. So that's how that happened. So this gives you a little color. These things, a lot of things are kind of, shall we say, accidental, but it's like this South African golfer, Gary Player. He's more in my age range. Most of you probably don't even know who he is. He's a very famous golfer, by the way. So Player has this great line. He says, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And I think that's essentially the name of the game.
I think I'm going to have to cut way back on the number of my questions. Believe it or not, I came here with 25 questions. I think I will get to 3. Well, anyway, I'll ask you a question.
Bill,
now.
I'm going to have short answers from now on.
I don't know.
I got the steam off, and
Yeah.
I'll be a little shorter.
No, if these inspire you, that's fine.
You did inspire me.
Good.
It was great for. Did I pass?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You told me a few years ago that you were on Milosevic's hit list because of your role in the Montenegro currency reform. You told me that you needed bodyguards when you traveled. What did Milosevic do or say that gave you reason to believe that you were in danger?
Well, now, the questions are getting more interesting with time. So I actually have been on an assassination list 2 times. The Milosevic was number 1. I knew it because they announced it. It was on the Yugoslav wire. The press secretary for the rump Yugoslavia announced the thing. So how did this come about? In late 1998, one of my good friends, Joko Bogatic, who is a Montenegrin, and he was at the time he was at the IMF. Now he's a very senior guy at the World Bank, a great economist. We got to talking about Montenegro, and Montenegro was part of the rump Yugoslavia. There was Serbia and Montenegro at the time. This is 1998, and Milo Đukanović was the president of Montenegro. He's still the president, by the way. He's been prime minister, president, and so forth. So he's let's put it this way: he knows how to play the game in the Balkans. It's a special kind of game that if you're not in the Balkans, you just can't get it. It's a unique geographic and cultural experience and place. So Bogatic said, let's do your usual thing. Let's write a book. So we wrote a book. It took us about 10 days. It's a great book, nice publication, everything, in Serbo-Croatian. And it proposed either a currency board or dollarization for Montenegro. And the idea was to get away from what? Get away from the Yugoslav dinar. Remember, 1994, that thing had hyperinflated to 313 million% per year. Then it went down, they put in a currency reform, then it went back up. So the place was a complete inflationary disaster and prime for some kind of currency reform. So at that point, I went in. That was another thing. You couldn't go to the capital, Podgorica. You couldn't get there directly. So you had to go we went from Dubrovnik. We flew to Dubrovnik, and then the cars picked us up with my bodyguards and so forth. And ultimately, in December of 1999, I'm getting ahead of the story a little. They did dollarize. They did Đukanović dollarize, and that was amazing because they literally, Milosevic had the tanks at the border. They didn't know whether they were going to invade. The Yugoslav army was going to invade at that time because here you have part of a country which has made another currency, the German mark, legal tender, and kicked out the Yugoslav dinar. So it was a very risky move. At that point, I was there a state counselor, so I was not only Đukanovic's chief advisor, but I was actually part of the government. So that gets into the hit thing. And the hit thing was that they announced that I was actually a member of something translated the Spider Group. And the Spider Group was part of the French Secret Service. And we were smuggling in fake dinars, fake Yugoslav dinars, and that was what was causing the inflation in Yugoslavia. So that was the thing they nailed me with. It was smuggling currency. They arrested two guys who were supposedly in this spider thing. Two Serbs that had dual passport, French passports and Yugoslav passports. They arrested them and threw them in jail. Of course, it reminds me of this line, Bill. Churchill, after the Boer War, Churchill said, "There's nothing more invigorating than being shot at, particularly if they miss." Well, they didn't actually fire a shot, but they missed. They didn't get me. And Đukanović was very clever. The Balkan people know what they're doing. So he wanted to protect me. Milosevic wanted to have me out. And it was on the wire. I've still got all these things in my file of, what they were accusing me. The second time, by the way, this is a little bit of a footnote. The second time I was in the Asian financial crisis, I was President Suharto's chief advisor, and the IMF had proposed in July of 1997 that Indonesia float the rupiah, and it completely sunk, and inflation shot up immediately. And it was, they were having food riots and everything else. And then Kem Desu, who was head of the IMF at the time, forced Suharto to sign off on some 50-point reform program that looked great on paper. It could have never been implemented. It's a complete impossibility. As long as you had a soft budget constraint, a floating exchange rate, and high inflation. So somebody had told Suharto that I was the guy, and of all things, I was in Istanbul with Mrs. Hanke at the time, and get a call from Suharto's office, and he wanted me to come the next day. I said, there's no way. I've got to testify before Congress next week, this, that, and the other. I said, I'll come as soon as I can. I came, I became his advisor. I proposed a currency board. He accepted the currency board. It was included in his State of the State speech in February of 1998. And the U.S. and the IMF went wild with this thing, absolutely wild, because the game plan was Clinton was the president then, and they were going to let the financial crisis in Asia take Suharto out. They'd had enough of Suharto, so it was a regime change thing. They didn't invade like we did in Iraq. They were going to let the financial crisis take him out. So they were panicked and they knew, by the way, because we'd just done Bulgaria, we'd just done Bosnia. The IMF had signed off on these things. They worked perfectly, and they knew. Larry Summers, an economist who, of course, you know, was the Undersecretary of Treasury at the time, and Summers had advised him, Clinton, he says, this thing Hanke's proposing will work, and you're going to be stuck with Suharto because inflation is going to be wiped out and the whole thing is going to be stabilized. So that started a huge counterattack, smear campaigns, et cetera, but it also caused Suharto to counsel me that he asked, would have told, but he said, well, for you and Mrs. Hanke, he said, I'm going to have to give you both protection because there are two secret services that I know are going to try to kill you. He said, is that okay? And I said, of course. So we had 24/7 lots of security because we had Suharto's personal security, and Mrs. Hanke had the late Mrs. Suharto's personal security with her. Anyway, they didn't get us. So we ultimately didn't get a currency board, by the way. Now, that's a very interesting thing. Why did Suharto change his mind? I was in Hong Kong. Actually, that time that I had lunch with Holbrooke in Hong Kong, I was up in Hong Kong, and I get a call from Suharto's chief of staff. He said, it's off. It's over. I said, you must be kidding. I said, it's over? I said, I want to speak to the president about it because it's definitely on. He's not, it really is off. So we went down to Indonesia. We found out that the U.S. had sent half of the Pacific Fleet to do exercises off the coast of Jakarta. And it spooked the military, and the military caved. The military said to Suharto, we're not going to support this thing. And that's the end of that story.
In the interest of time, I'm going to merge three questions now. So I'm going to read three questions, but they're related to each other. It's just sort of a long version of one long question. In August, Trump labeled China a currency manipulator, which amounts to a declaration of currency war with China. Was that claim justified? Has the U.S. ever done that before in Asia? Trump blames China for our trade deficit with China. Is he right? Trump's former economic advisor, Gary Cohn, has said that Trump's trade war with China is backfiring by hurting the U.S. but not hurting China. He said it is hurting U.S. manufacturing but giving China a convenient excuse for slowing down its overheated economy. Do you agree with Trump's tariff policy?
Well, I completely disagree with the perspective, the mercantilist perspective that's taken by the president. We had the same problem, by the way, in the Reagan administration. I was on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time, and I had the Japanese portfolio. And remember, enemy number one in 1981 was who? It was Japan. Japan was accounting for about almost 60% of the U.S. Trade deficit was a bilateral deficit with Japan. So what happened? You had the Council of Economic Advisors, of course, they were unilateral free traders. They were completely against any kind of quota, tariff, anything like that. Treasury, same thing. And the Office of Management and Budget, David Stockman was the famous director of OMB at the time, and they were against. But you had and you had Reagan. Reagan was a free trader, okay. So in the cabinet, though, you had people thinking like Trump and essentially all of Trump's cabinet, and they were mercantilists. They thought the problem was unfair trade practices, currency manipulation by the Japanese. So what happened? The free traders lost, as you know, and the mercantilist won. And so you have to say, well, what's behind their? Why do they think like this? Because it's kind of neo-mercantilist. It's not pure mercantilism like you read in a textbook where you're accumulating gold reserves and that's wealth, et cetera, et cetera. It's neo-mercantilist. Most of these people come from business, and this is a fallacy of composition problem. They think the economy operates like a business. In a business, they're looking at free cash flow. They're looking at the bottom line. So they know that if your revenues from sales are less than your expenses, you've got negative free cash flow, and that's bad because eventually, if you can't raise debt capital or equity capital, you're going to go bankrupt. So they think that's the way the country runs, like a business. They're thinking of it like free cash flow. So if you have a trade deficit or a current account deficit, they think it's bad, but they think it's like negative free cash flow for a business. So the currency manipulation part of Bill's question, the first thing, remember what happened with the Japanese. What we did with the Japanese, we not only had quotas, voluntary restraints, we beat the Japanese into this agreement. The Japanese agreed to restrict the number of automobiles they were sending into the United States. Well, they did, and they were too happy to do it. It was a good deal for the Japanese because what they started to do, they limited the number, but they would only send high-end cars, expensive cars with big spreads, big profit margins. So actually, that part ended up being a good deal for the Japanese. A very bad deal for the United States. The other thing that we did is that we strong-armed the Japanese to engage in what I call an ever-appreciating yen policy. And remember, the yen was at 360 to the dollar, and it did ever appreciate. We forced them to appreciate. The thing went down to 80 at a huge appreciation. And ultimately, it was Secretary Rubin who, remember the strong dollar mantra that Rubin had? Well, that was really a mantra to weaken the yen because he realized that Japan was collapsing. It was imploding at 80 yen per dollar. So the currency manipulation thing, it's the same idea with the Chinese. China had a perfect monetary regime from 1994 to 2005. And what was it? It wasn't a currency board, but it was a pegged exchange rate. The yuan was almost perfectly fixed to the dollar. So they had an exchange rate policy. They really didn't have a monetary policy. It was kind of and they had exchange controls or other problems, but they had very good performance. China's performance, the best decade they've had, is when they had that fixed exchange rate. Then the IMF in the United States, of course, the IMF is always involved in these things innocently, but the technocrats are justifying whatever the political decision is. The technocrats come in and do a lot of economic mumbo jumbo and justify the thing. They talked China into floating the yuan, remember? It's been a disaster. Ever since they floated, it's been one problem after another. The U.S. expectation was what? If they float, they will have an ever-appreciating yuan. But what they didn't realize is that as they take these capital controls off, or as leakage out of China occurs because the Chinese want to get their money offshore, there's a lot of leakage. And when that occurs, the yuan weakens. So there's no currency manipulation. If anything, I would say the U.S. was the manipulator. The U.S. was the one imposing the new regime on them. And they knew secretly what the game was. It was exactly what we did with Tokyo, an ever-appreciating yen. And they thought this would do wonders for the trade deficit in the United States and the current account deficit. Now, that gets to the last part of Bill's question, and that is, maybe the second part of his question, and that is, I've done a lot of work on this over the years, and what you have identities are very important in economics, and actually accounting is the most important thing in economics, really. And even if you look at a lot of what Bill does with the Divisia work. You go to the website of the Center for Financial Stability and you see, there are various components. What do you have, 14 components to M4 or something like that? You got there's a lot of accounting going on. You go to his October 2009 article in the New York Times. What's he talking about? He's talking about accounting and auditing the Fed and so forth. So accounting is very important. If you don't understand, and I learned this from, I had a great professor, one of my professors was fantastic, Kenneth Boulding, a very famous economist. And he was always on this, Steve, you got to get accounting under control. If you don't understand accounting, you're never going to understand any economics. And so that is one point I do want to stress. Accounting is extremely important. So the trade balance, the current account balance, it's all made in the United States. It has nothing to do with currency manipulation, with unfair trade practices, with international trade law or anything. It is made in the good old USA or made in Japan or wherever the local is. What it is, it's the identity. It's a savings investment identity, and we have an article that's just come out. Bill has a copy of the galleys. It's in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, the fall issue. And we derive the identity and a great deal of disaggregation. And what you end up with is that you have private savings and investment. That's one component, okay? And then you've got public savings and investment. And the public savings, of course, is just whatever the government takes in revenue and they consume. Whatever is the difference is, that's government savings. Investment, we know what that is. That's government investment. And we took it down to federal, state, and local. So we have everything. And it turns out that, as the textbooks say, the identity works. We have the disaggregated identity, and if you have a savings investment gap that's negative, you have a savings deficiency, you have a trade deficit and a current account deficit. And the current account deficit's going to exactly equal the gap. No matter what's going on in the rest of the world, it will equal. It must. It's an identity in national income accounts, and it must equal. So we looked at this, and then we looked at, of course, at the data after we derived the identity, and you end up with the following. If we look from 1973 through 2018, the savings minus investment, the total is minus 11.4 trillion. The current account balance is minus 11.5 trillion. Now they're not exactly the same because of errors, statistical errors and omissions and things like that. They're exactly the same. So this is made in the USA. It has nothing to do with foreigners. There's not one number in here that has anything to do with foreigners except through the back door. The back door is the countries like Japan that have a savings investment positive gap. They save more than they invest. They have a surplus of savings, and of course, we borrow it from them. It's a carry trade coming from Japan to the United States. So actually, if you look at trade, what is the trade balance and current account balance? They're really transactions in international savings. We borrow from them to finance our deficit. That's how you get it. So we looked at this for China. The data perfectly match up. The savings and investment gap is exactly equal to the current account surplus in the case of China. They save a lot. You look at someplace like Switzerland. Switzerland has what? They have a huge current account surplus. They save a lot. Germany. Why does Germany have such a huge current account and trade surplus? They save a lot more than they invest. So all these balances are homegrown and have nothing to do with what's going on in the outside world. The only thing that the currency, the trade practices, whatever you name it, whatever the mercantilists are complaining about, whatever China might be doing or Japan might be doing, that affects the distribution of who's filling the vacuum in the United States, but it doesn't affect the overall U.S. balance. So, did I miss anything there?
No.
Okay, so
I think I might have time for one more question. On May 23rd, 2019, you wrote an article in Forbes magazine with the following title: Could Donald J. Trump become America's Caesar? I would guess under the current circumstances, Donald Trump would like to know how to do that. Please explain how he could become America's Caesar.
Okay, now this gets into a little bit of a. There's actually a lot of economics involved in this, but this is calendar reform. So now we have, of course, the Gregorian calendar, which is used most throughout the world, but the Gregorian calendar has all kinds of flaws in it. I won't get into all the flaws because, and you can check my Forbes articles and you'll see what it's all about. So there have been movements to reform the Gregorian calendar and fix some of the flaws. And these have been going on for a long time, and they usually, oddly enough, I found this out, Bill, after the fact. I have collaborated with a physicist at Johns Hopkins University who I've known for years, Richard Henry, a very famous physicist, actually astrophysicist. And there's something called the Hanke-Henry permanent calendar. And there's a whole family of permanent calendars. And the reforms would be in all the proposals have been for some kind of permanent calendar. So there was one permanent calendar that was proposed and almost made it in the League of Nations. And then in the interwar years, it kind of died out. It didn't make it. But the problem with the permanent calendars, a permanent calendar remains permanent all the time. The Hanke-Henry permanent calendar, let me tell you what that is, and I'll back up to and I'll get into the Caesar thing right away. The Hanke-Henry permanent calendar, for each year, each date falls on exactly the same day of the week. Forever. You never need to change the calendar. So it's permanent. It stays the same. We have 4 quarters in a Hanke-Henry permanent calendar. The first 2 months have 30 days in them, and the last month has 31 days. So you have 91 days in each quarter, 364 days in a year. It goes on forever. You have to make an adjustment, and the adjustment is for actually scientific reasons more than anything else, and that is you have to, every 6 years, you have to add a week, and we add a whole week, an extra week, at the end of December in the 6th year. Now, if you don't do that, the way the sun is operating and the way we revolve around it, you'd have what's called calendar drift, and it's the same deal with leap year. If you don't put that in, pretty soon, in 100 years, Christmas is going to be in July or something. The thing is going to drift way away. So that's why you put the extra week in. So this thing has great features because one is that every calendar reform that has been proposed and almost passed, one, the League of Nations, and in the 50s, the United Nations came very close to passing a permanent calendar. They were both nixed because they screwed around with the 4th commandment. The 4th commandment is what? The Sabbath. You have to keep the Sabbath, a 7-day cycle. And the reason that the other permanent calendar proposals, all of them mess with the Sabbath because they're inserting an extra day someplace to make up, like the leap year type thing. And so they're out. They will never pass because of the Sabbath. There also is another big reason, and that is that for business reasons, they screw up the days in the quarter. We have 91 days in every quarter. Businesses report quarterly. You got to have 91 days. So they have a variable. So there's this fuzzy, and this has been another reason that businesses and accountants have objected to other permanent calendars. So our idea is, and we've drafted an executive order, the president could issue an executive order, and we have said that we would be willing to give up the name Hanke-Henry permanent calendar if it's a Trump calendar. So this would make, Trump hotels is peanuts compared to this. The guy would go down in history as, the greatest, can you imagine? Pope Gregory, So I can get into the economics of it, but I don't think, I detect a certain lack of enthusiasm for that. I would just say that after Henry and I did this, and I'll tell you how we got together on it, I have discovered that almost every one of these permanent calendars that's ever been proposed has had a scientific component, usually a physicist, and an economist. Now, the big backer, by the way, and I have the only documents on this because I went to the Yale archives. Irving Fisher was a big time fan of the permanent calendar that went down in the UN in 1955. He was a big supporter. And it was also supported by George Eastman of Eastman Kodak, and Eastman Kodak Company actually went on this permanent calendar that they were proposing, even though it messed up with the Sabbath. So how did I meet Henry? Well, Henry and I are, I'm now going, this is my 51st year of being a professor at Johns Hopkins. I was a professor someplace else before that, but I was 51 at Hopkins. So I think there's one guy who's hanging on. He's been there longer than me, and Henry actually is technically retired. He's a what do they call him? An academy professor, and he's still head of the Maryland Space Consortium, et cetera. I mean, he's very active, but. So I knew him, and this tells you a little the culture of Hopkins, and university people might be interested in this. I arrived in 1969, and in 1969, Hopkins was very different than it is now. We had 1,500 undergraduates, we had 1,500 graduate students. The undergraduates had no advisors or anything like that. It was a graduate school. I didn't teach an undergraduate course for like 10 years. Well, in the engineering department, I have 2 appointments, one in engineering and one in economics. In the engineering department, they didn't even offer undergraduate courses. There was no undergraduate course in that department. And the faculty. So how did I meet Henry? Well, in those days there were traditions, and the faculty club was regularly visited by the faculty, but there was a huge long table in the middle of the faculty club, and only, as they called themselves, the full bulls could sit at the big table. And if you were less than a full bull, an assistant or associate, you had to be invited by a full to sit at the big table. So ultimately, of course, I fortunately was promoted very rapidly. In fact, if I can brag, I was the fastest promotion ever in the history of Johns Hopkins. So I became a full bull very fast so I could sit at the big table. Henry was a full bull. We got to know each other. And precisely in 1995, so we knew each other. He was in physics. I was in environmental engineering and economics, but we saw each other all the time, and we're very good friends. Because that big table, you see, was collegial. Now all these departments are siloed and insular and not talking even to other departments and so forth. This is not the way it was then. So I knew Henry, and then the next part of the story comes in 1995. So in 1995, I had a hedge fund in Buenos Aires, the Toronto Trust Argentina, which happened to be, it was the world's best performing hedge fund in 1995. We were up 79.25% in 1995, and what would happen at the big table? People, what are you doing in Buenos Aires all the time, Hanke? And what are you investing in? And so I said, I got one. This is not a lesson in portfolio diversification. In 1995, we were the best performing fund in the world. I had one bono, as they call them, one bond, one Argentine peso bond. That was it. The whole portfolio, 100%. So Henry's listening, and I didn't pay any attention and went about my business. He called me about 9 months later. He said, Steve, he said, should I sell that bond I bought? I said, bond? What bond? He said, I bought some of those Argentine bonds you were talking about. And he said, they've almost doubled in value. I said, if I may, I think I said, Christ, you were listening to me and bought that thing? I said, I think it is a good time to sell it, Dick. So we became, shall we say, even closer friends. And then the calendar thing rolled around. And he started talking to me about his ideas about a permanent calendar, and he said, I'm getting sick and tired of every year having to redesign my syllabus, changing everything every single year, and I'm teaching exactly the same course because it's the Gregorian calendar that's screwing the thing up. So we got on this thing, and we actually taught a seminar on permanent calendar together and developed the Hanke Henry permanent calendar, and that's, as they say, that's the rest of the story. But that's how collaborations and things were happening under the old regime. That kind of thing, I think in the modern, unfortunately, for younger people, younger faculty people and so forth, it's not, the environment is completely different now than it used to be. So that has been, shall we say, a hobby, but it turns out there's a lot actually in the economics literature on things like, another thing we're advocating is the adoption of universal time. So the calendar is one part of it, Bill, but universal time, Greenwich Mean Time for everybody, because think about it, the time is the same every place in the world now. The only problem is we don't set our watches all the same. If we were on universal time, everyone in the world would set their watch at exactly the same time. And we don't have to get into the details of that, but that would do away, by the way, with time zones. And time zones, there's a lot in the economics literature actually written on time zones. There was actually an article in the April, let me just,
I should mention, China has just one time zone.
Yeah.
So it's certainly
Yeah.
doable.
Yeah, that's that, and you can switch. By the way, a lot of people, they switched to metric in Canada in 1971. Everybody says, oh, that's a lot bigger problem, by the way, than changing your watch, because you got to change tools and everything else. It was absolutely no problem. And Dick Henry likes to tell his story. Dick's a Canadian, by the way, Henry. So Dick loves to tell his story. He said his aging mother was up in Toronto, and Dick was down at Hopkins, of course, in Baltimore, and he called her one day and said, well, Mom, how is it? And she says, oh, it's horribly hot today. She said, it's 30 degrees. Mm-hmm. And he said he almost fell off of his chair because she'd switched. She didn't even realize she was very old, and she'd, switched. No big deal. So universal time's a lot easier than Caesar.
Technically speaking, we've run out of time, but I want to just ask one other thing. Also, one comment. When I was on the staff of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., I taught a graduate course at Johns Hopkins. I never saw that big table on the faculty club. I was not a fool bull. What I remember was dinners at a Spanish restaurant nearby, which was very nice.
Well, yeah, that's Tio Pepe's. Now, I'll tell you one, Bill. I have to tell you this. I have to tell you this story about Tio Pepe's because
Please make it fast.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've read that your students always receive job offers from Wall Street firms if they want them. To get those offers, they have to compete with applicants from the top-rated business school finance departments. Why are your students so successful in finance?
Okay, so 100% of them do get jobs. And number one, the only prerequisite I have, by the way, is accounting. and they have to have my permission to get in. So the average GPA, and these are Hopkins students, they're pretty good in general, but the low GPA is about 3.7. So they're all winners, And anyway, even before they get in with me. But the key thing is, I'm one of the few that actually teach them how to do something. So that means that everyone on Wall Street, they know my people can do things, and they don't require 2 months of training. They're all trainable, whatever they're doing within about a week. They actually can start producing something almost immediately. Now, what are the rules? The rules are we only use primary data. So you have to use primary data. That's very important. The second thing is everything has to be replicable. You have to be able to replicate everything. Everything is, so I have very strict standards. Primary data, and unless it really can't be found. Now, what's that mean? That means you have to go to a financial service provider like Bloomberg or something. Bloomberg is secondary data. It's not primary data. It's secondary data. And I think those are the key things, Bill. Primary data and replication, and as I always say to the students, I say this is a precision drill. They're not allowed to make one mistake. Every research memo has to be fully cited. There can't be one small mistake in the thing. Now, that comes from knowing how Goldman Sachs used to operate. It's still good, but it's not. It used to be 15 years ago. It was in completely a league by itself. So Goldman, I knew some of the partners, and I knew how they were operating, and they would hire the top MBA student from Wharton every year. And the top MBA student, what did the top MBA student do? The top MBA student was in charge of only doing one thing, making PowerPoints. That's what the top student. And if the top student made one error in a PowerPoint, he got a pink slip, or she got a pink slip that day. They were out, and they knew the conditions of work, and that was it. So there are essentially no errors. I get or very, very few. That's the reason. Now the Tio Pepe thing, I have to tell one story. Bill asked me, he told me that about his experience when he was teaching at Hopkins, and I says, yeah, of course I know the table. I've been at the table. It wasn't for the full bowls. It was a big round thing at the Spanish restaurant. And I can tell this, but a very, very good friend of mine, the late Bela Balassa, Balassa's work, you certainly have read Balassa and Samuelson. Very important. If you haven't read it, you better read it. So Balassa was Hungarian, pretty thick Hungarian accent, and we were interviewing somebody for a job, and we were going around the table. Everyone was ordering, and one of my colleagues, the one next to me, said, "What did Bela order?" He asked the guy next to him, he says, "What did Bela order?" And the comment was, "Peasant under glass." So that it's kind of, if you knew Bela, it worked. I mean, everyone had a good laugh. And so that table was serious, but there was some esprit de corps.
I'm not sure if we have use of this room for another question. Should I stop now, or can I ask another question?
Ask another one.
Ask another one. Okay, one more. This is sort of a combination of two questions. Many people are predicting a recession based on the inverted yield curve and Trump's trade wars, along with the slowing down economies in Europe and Asia. But you are not in a recent article in Forbes. Why are you not worried? Trump says that lowering interest rates would boost the economy. Is it true that lowering interest rates is necessarily expansionary because of Keynesian liquidity preference theory? That's my final question.
Okay. Well, let me kind of come to the end, but then go through the analytics, because the Keynesian thing with liquidity preference is very interesting, because everyone has it completely wrong. But what the reason is that the inverted yield curve, many people say the inverted yield curve is a good predictor of recessions, but every inverted yield curve that's ever predicted a recession has been accompanied with contraction of the money supply. It's all about money. It isn't about the shape of the yield curve or the locus of interest rates on where that curve is located in the quadrant. It's about the money supply. So what do I look at? You've got to look at Barnett. It's all in Divisia M4. You've got to have a model for national income determination, and the model is the monetarist model. That's the only one that works. So you have to have broad money has to be the measure, and the best measure is Barnett's Divisia. So it's Divisia M4. Now, what's been going on with Divisia M4? Late last year, it had gotten down to around 4%, I think, or something like that. It's been accelerating very rapidly, and the last bulletin that just came out, I think yesterday or the day before, it's at 5.9%. Now, that's a pretty healthy number. It's accelerating, and the rate of growth is fairly high. And if you look at you can do a simple, what you should do, and this is teaching my students how to do things. So you know what the quantity equation is. MV equals PY in the income form. So what you want to do is solve for M and put the inflation in there at 2%. That's the inflation target. So if you go get the data, which you probably never have done, you probably don't know how to do it, because no one's ever gotten a spreadsheet out and forced you to do it. But go to the quantity theory and do the simple calculation. Solve for M. M under that regime is what I call the golden growth rate. So the golden growth rate, where should it be to keep aggregate demand? And the best proxy for aggregate demand, again, is maybe something you don't know about. Final sales to domestic purchasers. You can get it on Fred. That is the best proxy for aggregate demand. So you get the golden growth rate, you solve for that in the quantity equation. The number is going to be about 5%, 5 to 5.5 or something like that, okay? Depending on the time period you use and so forth. So for M4, we solve the golden growth, we get, let's say, 5.5%. We get Barnett's measurement. It's very accurate now. It's 5.9. It's been coming up. So everything looks great. The trend rate of growth and aggregate demand should be staying about the same. Now, that doesn't mean there are problems, because we got President Trump tweeting, and we got trade wars and all these other external things. But in aggregate, that thinking about national income determination makes it a very solid. Bill cautioned me, I should say, a very, very low probability of a recession right around the corner. I said something in my Forbes, there won't be one, but let's just say there would be a very low probability. Now, let's come back. So that's the reason for my thinking about the U.S. economy. Most of what you're reading about is absolute rubbish, complete nonsense. And the investment banks, by the way, are the worst. They're all Keynesians. They've all been trained in regular economic departments like KU and so forth, have the Keynesian idea. They have liquidity preference under their belt. Now, liquidity preference says what? Interest rates drive the money supply. It's a negative relationship. If you look at the quadrant, interest rates and money supply, it's negatively sloped. No, in the real world, it's exactly the opposite. Liquidity doesn't exist in the real world, the liquidity preference with a negative slope. It's positive. So think of these. You got Venezuela, Argentina, and Turkey. Those are the highest interest rates in the world right now, and the highest money supply growth rates. It's positively sloped. So interest rates follow the growth rate in the money supply. Again, the money supply dominates. It determines nominal national income determination. It determines the inflation rate, and interest rates will follow the inflation rate. Now, it isn't a monotonic function. So if you, for example, if you increase the money supply, interest rates will tend to go down at first. Then the demand for credit goes up, asset prices goes up, nominal GDP goes up, and inflation kicks in, and then the interest rates start going up. So it isn't monotonic. And the same way, if you look at the other side, Where we have deflations, you've got Japan, Switzerland, and Euroland. And what happens? We have very low or negative interest rates and what? Very low rates of growth in the money supply. It isn't a negatively sloped function, as in a liquidity preference function. It's positive. And the bottom line here is, back to something that Bill had asked, interest rates are a terrible measure of or indicator of the monetary policy stance of a central bank. But what is in the models of all the central banks? Interest rates, not money. A friend of mine, a former student, when I was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, Mickey Levy, he's a very good practical economist, been on Wall Street for years. He was, and he's the head of the Shadow Open Market Committee, Mickey is. Ireland is on that thing too. But Mickey was invited to a Federal Open Market Committee about 2 months ago. He called me after the meeting. He says, "You're not going to believe this, Steve." He said, "They never mentioned the word money in the whole meeting." So that's where we're at. Oh, by the way, go back, Irving Fisher, all this is laid out in the Theory of Interest, 1930, Irving Fisher. Interest rates follow inflation. The money supply goes up, and if it's sustained and goes up on a sustained basis, you're eventually going to get more inflation, and interest rates will eventually go up. It's all in Irving Fisher, 1930. I mean, everything is very clear.
I want to thank Steve for coming here. I should mention, I've been trying to get him to come here for quite a few years. I don't quite know how I got so lucky to get him to come here this time, but I want to thank him again. There's now a reception. I understand it's going to be on the top of the hotel, so it'd probably be very enjoyable to go over there. It's nice weather. We can all go over there now and talk some more. Thank you again,
Well,
Steve.
Bill, thank you.